my name is Sammy. I'm a technical analyst with ResDAC, and today I'll be talking to you guys about creating an analytic file. So what are we going to talk about today? Generally, we're going to talk about what an analytic file is, how you can kind of plan an analytic file, and then sort of a very broad idea over how to create an analytic file. So we won't be going over any code, but it's more conceptually how you can think about putting the files together. We'll be discussing some troubleshooting tips with examples, and then just kind of reviewing everything we talked about. So the first question, what is the benefit of an analytic file? So analytic files are made by us for us. So you can think about them as they're your cleaned and processed data files that allow us to complete our goals. The idea here is that you can't just use CMS data right out of the box. Normally, you need to make some type of edits, either to improve your processing time or to make sure that you have all the indicators you need. Normally, you have to do something beyond just taking out the CMS data and working on it right away. The look and feel of your analytic file really depends on your project needs. Sometimes even depends on the analyst, right? So depending on how well you work, maybe you want something that a file that has everything, right? Sometimes you want a file that has only exactly what you need. Sometimes you want to have multiple files that you just kind of merge together depending on what you're working on at the time. Again, it's really based more on what your workflow as an analyst is and how you best think. And why would we use analytic files? And the idea is that they make our jobs easier, right? So you save your analytic files so they're ready to use. You don't have to code and process each time. You remove the noise when reviewing output. And the best one, you prevent overwriting your original data. Although analytic files in general, making them isn't super easy up front, but the payoff down the road is typically worth the effort. So how can you go about thinking on analytic files? So just a quick disclaimer, this is one of many ways to think about your analytic file. The way that I'm talking about today probably speaks more to my way of thinking than to the way that you should be thinking. So definitely take what works for you and ignore what doesn't. This is really just sort of a jumping point to like thinking like, oh, this is like one way I can think about how to work with CMS data. So the way that I'm going to talk about today is kind of creating an analytic file by working backwards, right? So you start with your end product, your big picture, and then you move backwards to identify the steps that you need to get to your final product. One benefit to this way of thinking is that your big picture is at the forefront. One difficulty of sort of thinking this way is that you kind of need to be a little bit comfortable with the data file structure and the variables available. If you're not as comfortable, it might just take a little bit more time, but I think if you are the type of person, and I am this type of person, where you have to have a list before you go into Target, because otherwise you will go into Target, buy everything you don't need, and then have to take a second trip to actually buy the things you did need. This type of thinking, at least in my experience, works really well. So I kind of describe here some ways to think about creating your analytic file, right? So you have a planning phase. That's where you figure out, what am I creating? What is the final thing I want? Then you think about, how can I create a file that I can that will create the final product that I want? And then step 3 in this case is, what do I need to create that analytic file, right? So this is all sort of creating a roadmap for you to follow. And then we have the creation phase, and that's sort of thinking about, that's more about actually implementing what your roadmap is. So in this case, you use your roadmap. It's not going to be perfect. That's okay. For me, I kind of like to plan out where I'm going, again, to just make sure that I get to the correct endpoint. And then once you create your analytic file, taking some time to review it and making sure that you troubleshoot things as necessary. So step 1 is design the final product. And I use this slide to kind of illustrate that designing your final product is not just kind of like, boop, it's there. There's a lot of things that go into it, right? So you've got your study design, you have to think about your cohort and your data sources. So I do want to emphasize that I understand a lot of different things go into the final product. I just kind of summarize it here for simplification purposes. For some of you guys, your final product might be something like a summary table or regression model. Some of you might be working on tools, machine learning, dashboards, etc. So again, you want to think about your final product as Like this is the thing that I want at the end of the journey. So I'm coming up with a little fake scenario here. We're interested in understanding ER wait times for a list of hospitals that we have. So our study design in general is, do ER wait times impact patient outcomes? We're using Medicare data, so our cohort is limited to the Medicare beneficiaries who utilize the hospitals in our external data set. And then sort of thinking things through, we know for sure we're probably going to use Medicare claims, and then we have like a fictional hospital ER wait time data set that's non-CMS, like this is fake. And then what we're looking to create is a regression model. So digging more into the final product, I have it listed in two ways here. So the first one, I kind of have it listed just all written out, right? We have the outcome here. So that's negative patient outcome, a 1-0 variable equals average ER wait time. I label this as continuous, age, which is also continuous, and then female, so 1-0. And then we have a table underneath, again, just like two different ways to think about the same item, whatever works best for you. So we've got predictors on the left, and then we have the outcome on the right. So we kind of have an idea what we want our final product to be. So the next step is to think, what does the analytic file have to look like so that we can create what we deemed as our final product, right? So some questions you can ask yourself is, what is my row going to be, right? What is your unit of measurement? And what variables do I have to use in analysis? So those would be your columns. So I have the top table here kind of like laying things out. So we're thinking about claims. We're thinking about our unit of measurement as a claim because we can identify emergency room visits at the claim level. And then necessary variables, pretty clearly, if you're working with like regression, you want to make sure that all the variables in your regression model are included in your necessary variables. And then additional variables, totally up to you on how you want to define it. Here, I've put the Benny ID and the provider ID. Benny ID for linking demographic information, and then a provider ID to link to our fake external data set. So when you take all that information and sort of translate it into a dummy table, that's how you get what you see below. So, you know, we've got claim ID, Benny ID, so on and so forth. So let's go ahead and sort of do a poll, get your brain juices going after lunch. So what unit of analysis will you use in your studies using CMS data? So are you thinking beneficiary, patient, provider, so on and so forth? And I'll give you guys a little bit of time to fill this out. Seems pretty chill now. It looks like most of you will be working at the beneficiary and patient level, so great. For those of you choosing other options, even unsure and undecided, that's totally okay. Again, this is sort of just helping you conceptualize the ways to not only design your study, right, but also to design the analytic file that you'll be using for your study. So, the first question you kind of need to ask is what data do I need for my analytic file, right? So a couple of things you can do. You can start with ResDAC or CCW resources, right? So I've added some links here. You should be able to click on these links when you download the PDF from the course website. Some links I have are from our website, the file availability, which is essentially a long list of files, the years that they're available, and any sort of interesting notes and whatnot. And then you can click on the file names in our file availability table for more information on those files. Find the CMS data file you need is actually really nice as well. So for those of you who are really brand spanking new, that might actually be like a good first place to start. So you're not sort of overwhelmed by all of the files and the different labels. It's sort of an easier way to walk you into thinking about what CMS data you need. And then CCW, which is the data distributor, they have data dictionaries available on their website. We also have data dictionaries on our website, but both of them, they have the same information, but just formatted differently. So sometimes I find it helpful to go to the ResDAC website. Sometimes I find it useful to download CCW's data dictionary. So I think having both available is really helpful. So we've gone through the ResDAC and CCW resources, right? We think about what files do we want? And that's sort of this like secondary bullet point here where we know, okay, we want the inpatient file, but we also want to think about file segments, right? So Beth talked a little bit about this. when you get the inpatient, you just don't get like a single inpatient file. There's a header, there is a revenue center, there's an occurrence file, so on and so forth. So in this sense, we're thinking, okay, we want inpatient header and inpatient revenue center. And then I like to go even a step further into the meta and identify the variables of interest, right? So in the header, I'm thinking about the Benny ID, the claim ID, principal diagnosis code. And then when I go into the revenue center, thinking about similar things, right? Benny ID, claim ID, revenue center code. I find this step of looking at the variables of interest very helpful because that normally means I have to dig into the variable and confirm that what I'm assuming about the variable is true. You will find out later after you code it, but sometimes it's nice to kind of have a heads up before you go. So sort of, again, this is sort of thinking and planning ahead, like what data do I need and what information from those data sets do I need? So what do you do if you have to choose between two data sources with similar information? I think Beth covered this thinking about MedPAR versus inpatient claims files. But just highlighting this again, how do I choose between the two data files? First off, you want to think about sort of, the basics, right? What about the file contents, right? What about the variables that you receive? How complete are the variables? Do the definitions of the variables meet my expectations, or will they help me, complete my study? Where are the variables derived from, if they're derived variables? For example, like MedPAR does have summary variables. And then you have external factors and restrictions, right? So you have to think about your budget, your time, your effort, all these other things that might implicate whether or not you can have MedPAR versus inpatient claims files. So this is sort of another thinking strategy that I do when I'm working on creating an analytic file. So I'll have my dummy table. I normally like write it out on a sheet of paper. I don't do it all in like Excel or anything. But I will sort of write it out and then figure out, okay, what file can I get all of this information from, right? So kind of going through the first 4 columns, I kind of do a circle. And then the files of interest that I have here, inpatient and outpatient, because one, we want to identify emergency room visits. So we'll need the inpatient and outpatient for that. And then we're also going to use those files to define patient outcome. This is the patient outcome stuff will be all off screen, so we're not going to dive too deeply into that. And then we have average ER wait time. That's going to come from our external data set. And then we have age and female, which again, age is our continuous and female is our 1-0. And we're going to grab those from the demographic file or the master beneficiary summary file. So just sort of expanding on our fake scenario, we've decided that we're going to go with 1 year of inpatient claims, 1 year of outpatient claims, and 1 year of the master beneficiary file base segment. And then we're going to have our external data. So again, that's like a fake data set. And then before moving forward, some assumptions, not a safe assumption to make if you are working right off the bat, but for ease and comfort, we're going to assume that the data are clean and we've already created our indicator variables. And before we go too far deep, the tables here actually don't display real CMS data. They're all randomly generated in Excel for use in this workshop segment. All right, so now we're going to get into like the detailed roadmap, right? We're gonna think about what is our final product, and then how can we move backwards until we reach our quote unquote raw file, right? So that's kind of explained here. We have our final product into the analytic file into the data. So I kind of start off with, okay, the analytic file will feed, so the analytic file will create the table that you see there. So we know for at least demographics and our emergency room wait time, we can actually pull those directly from our external file in the MBSF base without really needing to make any changes. The bigger thing we kind of need to work out is our all emergency room events file. So what does that look like? We know that we're going to pull data at least from the inpatient and the outpatient. And because those are separate files, I separate those out separate. And then even within the outpatient and inpatient file, right, we're going to have to work with the claim level or the header file or the header segment, excuse me. And then we'll also have to work with the revenue center file. So that's how those two are split up, both for ER or for outpatient and inpatient. You see that I call it inpatient or outpatient revenue center rollup. I'll get into that in a little bit. And then we finally get to the unaltered file or the raw file. And so that's kind of how I think about my roadmap. Once you get really comfortable with the data, this happens a lot faster than what I just kind of explained. But I wanted to lay out kind of the idea of if you take your time with it, if you've never worked with it before, this is one way that you can think about it. So let's go ahead and sort of think about conceptually, how do we actually create the analytic files? So remember how we started sort of with what we wanted on the left and then the raw files on the right? I'm actually going to flip the map so that now we'll just kind of read it from left to right. So don't be too confused. So you can see here, you know, we flip the map so that we can kind of like follow it back to our analytic file. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll up the revenue center files. So what does roll up mean? We need one row per event, except if you're working with revenue center or line level data, you typically have multiple lines or rows you can think per single claim. So what you need to do is roll it up, which ultimately means deciding how you're overwriting or summarizing your data points, right? How do you know that you're keeping what you want and you're removing what you don't need? This is at this step, you have to be really conscious about how your code may accidentally duplicate, overwrite, or delete rows. Especially when you work with a file as large as the CMS data files, you might think intuitively like, oh, this is going to be fine. But then it's not. That's happened to me a lot. This is me trying to save you guys from that type of heartbreak. So here we have our, it's like a reduced variable inpatient revenue center file with our added indicators. So we have an indicator for emergency room revenue center codes, and then we have an indicator for our negative outcome criteria. So the first thing we want to do is we're going to remove the non-ER claims using the indicator variable. So if you see zeros in the ER revenue center code column, that's because the claim overall has at least one in it. And then we end up with something that looks like this. But see here at this stage, we still have multiple rows per single claim. So that's where we're going to have to do the roll up. So we're combining rows on claim ID, and then what we're going to do is we're going to keep the maximum value of negative outcome criteria 1. Again, this is like dependent on your study, right? So make sure that, you know, this is not the only way. You don't have to keep the maximum of your outcome criteria. It's all dependent on what you need for your study. And we end up with this table here. So notice we are not really concerned with how the claim through date and the claim line number are overwritten. We're going to be removing those. So here is an optional step is removing irrelevant variables. When the table is like so small, you can see it on a presentation. You don't really have to worry too much about processing time. But when in my experience, having worked with claims data, it is really helpful to remove the variables that you don't need, not only for processing time, but also visual clutter. And by visual clutter, I mostly mean if you have to go back and manually look at your data set, you want to make sure that your eyes don't glaze over the things that are important. And so by just making sure that only the important things are present, the likelihood of your eyes glazing over is lower. And that's how we end up with this table that we see right here. So a quick summary, let's see here. We started with the table on the left, and then we ended up with the table on the right. And what we did, right, we removed claims with no ER revenue center codes. We combined items based on claim ID, and then we removed the variables that weren't relevant to our analysis. And through the magic of the internet, we've gone ahead and redid all that except for the outpatient file. So that is kind of completing the roll-up part of the roadmap that we have here. So the next thing we want to do is we want to merge our claim file, so the header file, with the roll-up file that we just created. So on the left, you will see like a claim header file with the added indicator. So that's our second negative outcome criteria. And then on the right, you'll see our revenue center rollup file. Notice here, rollup isn't necessary for the claim file, at least for what we're doing here, because each line represents one claim. So we merge on claim ID and Benny ID, and then we remove anything that's not merged. And then that's how we end up with this table here. And so another step that we do here is we calculate our final negative outcome criteria. So if criteria 1 and criteria 2 are both 1s, then our final negative outcome is also a 1. We remove the irrelevant variables again. If you couldn't tell, I'm an analyst that likes to keep things as small as possible. And then we end up with this file that you see here. Note that we are keeping the provider number because this is necessary to link to our external data set. And again, another magic of the internet, we've done the merge for our outpatient files. All right, so we've completed that. And now we're gonna actually merge our inpatient and outpatient ER events. We'll not merge them. We're actually going to concatenate them or just stack them on top of each other. So we're making the assumption that inpatient and outpatient emergency room events should be separate so we can feel comfortable stacking these data sets on top of each other. This is not true for every situation. So you really want to make sure that before you stack things on top of each other, there's not a chance for duplicates. And so we went ahead and stacked them here. This is an extra step. If you're working with RIF data, this is unlikely something that you'll have to worry about. I'm just doing this because I don't like the numbers overlapping. So if you are really unsure and you want to make sure that things don't overlap, you could make your own event IDs. It's just that you have to make sure that you have some type of indicator in case you ever want to link back to the original claim. All right, so we went ahead, all good with that. So now we can actually go ahead and merge all of our files together. So you'll see on the left-hand side, that's our all ER events file. That's the one we just made. And then I've circled the beneficiary column to show that it'll link to the MBSF base. And then I've also circled the provider number column to show that it'll link to our external file. And then you put everything together, and then this is what it looks like. We did it. Awesome. Last but not least, I always compare the final table and my planned table. Sometimes, at least for me, I kind of get caught up in some of the details, and then I might forget an indicator or two. So just comparing it to what I originally wanted is a way for me to safeguard and make sure that I have everything that I need. So let's go ahead and do another poll question. So this is for people who have worked with CMS claims data. If you have worked with the claims data in the past, has it been your experience that an analytic file comes together this easily? Yes or no? And if no, what have been or I guess if yes too, you probably also had these issues, but what are your most common issues? So is it missing information? Duplicates you're not quite sure what to do with, 2 pieces of data with conflicting information, findings that you can't explain, or more than one or all of the above. It sounds like for most of you, it doesn't really come together this easily. So I'm glad I'm not the only one. I think the struggle is real, totally relatable. And a lot of you are saying a lot, more than one of these things pop up when you're working with your analytic file. And that's the truth. That is the absolute truth. So it's great to kind of see that the experience is similar throughout. So let's talk about troubleshooting now. When talking about troubleshooting your analytic file, the first thing is my analytic file actually correct? and some ways to sort of think about what's happening in your analytic file. Is it an issue concerning data? Is it an issue concerning policy behavior? What other resources could be out there to help you guys solve things? And then some programming considerations. So this, most of these, the ones that I'll talk about are SAS-centric, but they're very high level. I think they can apply to most programming languages. So how will I know if my analytic file is correct? Typically, your programming language will tell you if it's incorrect. That's how I live my life a little bit. So your final product, it'll produce some type of error when you run it. It'll look strange visually, or it just won't go at all. Also at this step, I do recommend for your analytic file to just run some general data frequencies for things that are particularly important for you. If you're working with like a numeric or continuous variable, just running a proc means, making sure that things don't look completely out of left field. You can also compare what you're seeing to other CMS sources or lit reviews if that's available to you. I normally don't recommend trying to recreate CMS tables. We've had researchers who are pulling their hair out for not being able to match up maybe like 100 to 1,000 people when comparing to a CMS source. Beth Vernon will probably tell you this, but like trying to recreate those, it's just too much of a headache. If you're in the ballpark, feel pretty comfortable in that. And then you can also just trust your gut instinct. And if you haven't worked with the data before, you will develop this gut instinct. But essentially, it's like anytime you're like, oh, that's kind of weird, that's kind of interesting, just take a quick look to make sure that everything is running as intended. So we're going to go into general considerations. I'm just kind of outlining it here before I split off into the related to data versus relating to policy behavior descriptions. So what do we consider when it comes to potential data things, right? So is this something that happens on the raw file versus the analytic file? This is a question that we get a lot where researchers will say something like, I'm researching pregnancies in Medicare and, I'm seeing a really strange frequency. Like, let's pull something out in air. Like everyone is not, everyone in Medicaid who is given birth in my data set is male. That clearly, kind of sets off some flags if everybody is male. So normally what we'll do is we'll ask like, is this something that you see in your raw file, which by raw file, we typically mean the file that you receive directly from CMS. So you just get, after that, researchers are like, oh, it's not showing in the raw file. So they work on their programming to make sure that their analytic file is working as intended. Other things with data, are there any data points that need to be removed or addressed? So some things you have to look out for duplicate data points, right? So maybe it's the same beneficiary showing up on the same day, so on and so forth. And then also, do you include denied claims in your study, right? Or if you're working in Encounter, do I include chart reviews? You want to make sure that you kind of have an idea of how to handle these things as they arrive. And then also when you work with data, how consistently do you find your issue? This is more of a directional question, right? So when you see something happen, how frequently does it happen and where does it frequently happen? That can typically be your sign, like, oh, this is where I look to find more information. And then another data slide here. Am I choosing the right variables or values for my study? Nate talked about this, right? So how many diagnosis or procedure codes are you using? Some variables may not be as intuitive as you think. So one that regularly had me stumped when I first started was the state code, right? You would think there is one code per state in state codes, but that's actually not the case. Some states in the state code variable, some states have multiple values. So do you keep both values? Do you use the value that has the most? Do you compare the two, see what's going on? So that's something to keep an eye out for. Have there been any major coding changes? I think we've talked about this a lot as well, the ICD-9 to ICD-10, just making sure that you have the codes if you're working with any of the transitionary years. CMS also lists new and discontinued ICD or HCPCS codes. There are some links there if you want to click on it, if you have the PowerPoint in front of you. And then is there any additional information in the data dictionary? The data dictionaries are very juicy in terms of information. The comment section will often tell you things that you're like, oh, I assume this and this about this variable, but that's not true at all. The comment section actually says this. The data dictionaries, both from ResDAC and CCW, will also include a data source. And sometimes CMS actually posts the data dictionaries for the data source itself. So you have here the NCH, I believe it's the National Claims History. So if you see any variables where the source says NCH, you can actually look up that data dictionary. And sometimes that data dictionary has additional information that kind of explains what you're seeing. So we're going to go over an example now. So this actually happened to me very recently. In context, we have a provider numbers article on our website. And when I first created the article, I was not as skilled at navigating claims files as I am today. And so I just chose December of the carrier file to define how filled a variable is, right? So fill in this case is, does it have something or does it not have anything? So using that method, which I'm calling method 1, the completion rate was 27.4%, right? More recently, I am a lot better at sort of navigating large files. And so I was like, well, what if we use the 100% file instead? And when we actually did that, the completion rate was a lot lower. It was 4.3%. That change, very stressful, very panic inducing. So I had to take a closer look and I was like, oh my goodness, have I just been wrong this whole time? And the answer is technically no. No, I wasn't wrong. So you can see here, I have monthly site of service fill variable. So you'll see in January, it sort of starts really, really low, right? 0.06%. But by December, we're up at the 27.4 that I had originally found. So the reason why the percent was so low was because overall, throughout the year, it wasn't very filled, but because it was actually improving over time, December's percent of fill was very high. And I think it's just a really great way of showing how time periods can have unintended impacts on your outcomes. So now let's go ahead and talk about things related to policy and behavior. So when you're thinking about, anomalies or quirks that you see in your data, what policies might be impacting that, right? So some situations might be claims manual processing related, right? So there's something called professional versus technical components. If you're researching that, they're actually very uniquely coded. So if you need to find those types of components, you have to go into the claims manual and be like, oh, how is CMS telling providers to bill for this? Has CMS policy changed over time, or did they introduce new policies that impact your study topic? So I think Peter sort of showed this too while he was talking about the economics. Like CMS is changing, right? And so these changes can impact what's popping up in your data. And then were there any events that impacted my analytic file? I think one of the most recent ones is COVID, right? So if you're working with, 2020 data onwards, how does that event impact what you're seeing in the file? So we're going to go over a policy example here. So just some context, we are just looking at total claim counts in home health agencies from 2018 to 2020. And you'll see that in 2020, there is a relatively large spike. It's kind of strange. So me being in the same mindset as I was in my previous example, I'm like, what if I just do like a monthly breakdown and see what's going on? And so when you take a look here, you notice that the jump seems to start in February of 2020. So if you're not sure if it's a policy issue or not, there's some sources that you can look at. So for CMS sources, they actually have announcements and information on policy changes on the specific, fee-for-service payment page. The small text is just kind of how to get there from the CMS website. They also have a Medicare Learning Network articles and publications. These are like very easy to read, very straightforward. instructions that CMS makes for providers, specifically for any policy changes or how to payment instructions, things like that. And they also have the claims processing manual. I think everybody has sort of talked about this already. It is the most technical of the three sources I'm listing here. But once you kind of get a feel for how the claims processing manual is trying to describe things, I think it's a really powerful tool for you to have in your back pocket. Other ways that you can find CMS sources, your favorite search engine. Potential keywords, they're very straightforward here. I'm not doing anything super fancy. It's like 2020 Home Health Agency CMS policy change. Nothing crazy. If you're just starting to work with CMS data, it might take a little bit for your search engine algorithm to figure out what you want. I've been at ResDAC since 2017, so my search engine algorithm knows exactly what I want at this point. So don't feel too disheartened if you don't find what you need right away. Sometimes the algorithm just kind of needs to understand what you're looking for better. There's also the Wayback Machine. This is a website that lets you look at, I don't want to say like just CMS. So it actually archives websites from all over the internet, but in terms of CMS, it actually lets you look at older instances of CMS web pages. This is really useful in circumstances where you think maybe there was an announcement on a page that's no longer present. So I think for CMS, you can almost go back as far as like 1996 or 1992. It goes pretty far back. Not every page is documented, so you will come up with a lot of 404s or a lot of like error missing pages, but when you do find it, it does feel very rewarding. So definitely, you know, try the Wayback Machine if there's an older policy that you're having trouble finding information on. So the solution to the policy example is actually in 2020, CMS changed the home health agency policy. They shifted where a claim could indicate a 60-day episode to claims indicating a 30-day episode. So any claims that would normally be from 31 to 50 or 31 to 60 days are now two claims rather than one claim. So for January 2020, we kind of saw that jump start in February. We're kind of writing it off a little bit because because for me, I know that there's always some type of like onboarding, on-ramping time period. Sometimes CMS states it very clearly when they make the announcement. Sometimes it's a little wishy-washy. So for January 2020, we're just assuming that the delayed jump is kind of like a transitionary period for home health agencies to sort of get used to, oh, we actually have to submit for the 60-day rather than the 30. Or the 30 rather than the 60, excuse me. So general considerations, other resources that you can try. Definitely reach out to colleagues. We're all sort of in this together, trying to understand the CMS claims data. Feel free to try a sensitivity analysis, right? So do one with, do one without, and then compare and see, how do those compare to each other? Just give it a try. So if there's something where you're like, oh, I don't know if that's like gonna make sense. Especially if you're starting out, just like try it. You'd be kind of surprised at what you learn by failing a lot of the time. So don't be afraid to try things in the data. And then, of course, reach out to ResDAC if you have any questions. We're also a resource here for you guys. So what do you do if there is no real answer? So I'm showing 4 claims here, 2 for beneficiary A and 2 for beneficiary G. Their claim from and claim through dates overlap, and there's not anything that sort of indicates that one is more wrong than the other. So in very plain terms, this decision is normally not very easy. But how can you think about what to do with duplicate claims, right? It's always informed by what your study or project needs are. But in very broad terms, you could keep both, you could delete both, or you can keep one. And then when you keep one, how do you define that? Do you have a criteria or do you choose random? So it's very, very high level. It's not like as easy as like, oh, just keep both. You definitely want to think about what works best for your study and what happens if you do one versus the other. So if you're not sure what to choose, just try all of them. Actually, I think what's important is not just like who's kept and what does your outcomes look like based on your criteria, but what do you lose based on your criteria? Who's getting dropped? What information is being lost when you choose a certain methodology? All right, so let's go ahead and talk about programming considerations. Again, these are just very high level. They're SAS centric, but you can probably apply this logic to other coding programs. So ways to identify potential mistakes. You can review the log, not just for error messages, but I also like to use the log to look at row counts as I'm reducing my file. Sometimes you're like, oh, I think this should reduce. This should be reducing my files, and then sometimes it doesn't reduce at all. Um, also, run a small subsample first to make a visual confirmation. And by this, I essentially mean like run it on 10 people and make sure that all of your logic works exactly how you want it to. When I first started out, one, did not know how to effectively sort of navigate through the data. And two, I may have forgotten semicolons here and there. And so it would be really painful to like, wait a day, wait a half a day, wait multiple days. And then at the end, it's like nothing ran because there was this error. So run on a small subsample first. And then always, run monthly or annual frequencies to make sure that everything is working as intended. So how do you sort of think about fixing mistakes? You can use the log to inform potential coding issues. I sometimes log gets it for me, and then sometimes log just tells me where the problem is, and I have to figure out for myself what SAS is actually having a problem with. My favorite thing to do is to copy the error, paste it into Google, and then see what Stack Overflow posts pop up. I'm sure if you guys are analysts, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So definitely use the log to your advantage. And you want to double check your variable names, your formats, and your definitions. Like for me, starting out, I was very confident that NPIs were all numeric. So I would treat it as a numeric variable and oftentimes would stumble because it's actually a character value. So errors abound there. So, if something's not working as intended, just double checking that the formats are working, or the format is what you intend it to be, or what you think it is. And then last but not least is the tried and true IT standard. Have you tried turning it off and turning it back on again? I don't know why it works, but sometimes it really does. So don't be afraid to just restart your programming or your coding program if there is any type of issue. So let's go over sort of what we just talked about in the last 45-ish minutes. I think it depends is kind of the general feeling whenever it comes to, handling your study or your project. But in general, there are lots of benefits to an analytic file. It's really there to save you time. It's really there to make sure that it has everything that you need. It takes a lot of work up front to design and create it, but I think, overall it should pay off. And then when you're thinking about troubleshooting, is it data related? Is it policy or behavior related? Is it both? Is it programming, right? There are a lot of different ways that you can tackle issues when you're seeing them in your analytic file. And then last but not least, when you are sending your troubleshooting questions to ResDAC, here are some ways that you can kind of frame your question. So when you send us a question, we don't send you a question back. The first thing we want to kind of talk about is like, what is your overall goal or problem? Having that context is really important. Are you working with a cohort? Are you working in the VRDC or with physical data? What years of data and data files are you using? And then you'll notice right here is where I put what is your issue. Having all that additional context can actually help us figure out like, oh, having all of that context can help us better answer what your issue is. And then how frequently can you identify your issue? In your excitement to send us a question, please don't send us individual data tables or points or screenshots of your data. This is in violation of CMS's cell suppression policy, and we want you to stay in alignment with your with your DUA. So we understand that you guys want us to really understand what's going on, but we want you to not violate your DUA.